Most technological achievements, engineering marvels, new inventions were funded by private individuals, private businesses, and private universities. So let's start with the decade of the 1910s. Beginning in 1913, Fred W. Wolf Jr. invented the first electrical refrigerator for home use. Imagine what your life would be like today without refrigerated food or your freezer. But all of these names that you have heard in my podcast today, 16 of them you have never heard. All of them had active minds that were energized by the political liberty of Western civilization, the economic freedom of capitalism, and the wealth that is created by free markets. As mentioned, these are the unsung heroes who I believe have earned the status of protected class. If that were be the case today, that would be poetic justice. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Moneyball Method Podcast. As usual, this is Mark Shupe, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for objective investing. And as you may recall, last week I discussed the technological achievements and the venture capital that funded them during the decades of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And what I'd like to do today is continue with that theme and move even further back in time to the decades of the 1910s, the 1920s, and 1930s. There are some differences, of course. Venture capital didn't really exist prior to World War II. Most technological achievements, engineering marvels, new inventions were funded by private individuals, private businesses, and private universities. So let's start with the decade of the 1910s. Beginning in 1913, Fred W. Wolf Jr. invented the first electrical refrigerator for home use. But it wasn't until 1927 that General Electric's team of engineers created their monitor top technology for mass market success. Imagine what your life would be like today without refrigerated food or your freezer. But also in 1913, Henry Ford introduced the assembly line manufacturing at his Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan. This meant interchangeable parts, subdivided labor, and mechanized movement. The result was lower prices, higher quality, and mass market luxuries that were unimaginable throughout all of previous history. In 1915, the New York Times announced the discovery of stainless steel by Henry Brearley of Brown Firth Steels in Sheffield, England. By adding chromium, the steel didn't rust and could be used for any number of needs that required sanitary conditions, such as food preparation, medical procedures. This replaced expensive silver and nickel-plated silver. And then in 1919, the Dutch company Nederlandisch Radio Industrie and its owner-engineer Hanzo Idzerda made its first regular entertainment radio broadcast over station PCGG from its workshop in The Hague. And in 1920, Westinghouse produced its first American broadcast from Pittsburgh, and in 1922, there were 500 radio stations throughout America. These are radical achievements. These have altered the way we live and the luxuries and leisure time that we can afford in ways that were unimaginable prior to the 1910s. But also notice something. The names that I'm highlighting, with the exception of Henry Ford, are not household names. These are the unsung heroes of Western civilization, and I'll discuss more about them toward the end of my podcast today. However, this decade, the 1910s, also reversed much of the political liberty and economic freedom that was achieved, that was gained in the 18th and 19th centuries. World War I produced a war on a massive scale that could only be funded by massive government debt. And the administration of Woodrow Wilson in the United States shoved the income tax and the popular election of U.S. senators down the throats of every American. Let's move forward to the 1920s. In 1920, we had the premiere of the American Western romance film, The Mark of Zorro. This was the age of silent movies. And up until this point in my podcast series about technological innovation and venture capital, I've been doing secondary market research. I have been relying on other sources. However, for this particular segment, I was actually present last week at the showing of The Mark of Zorro, filmed in 1920, that starred Douglas Fairbanks and the mighty Wurlitzer organ. In fact, this performance not only highlighted a masterpiece of silent film production from 126 years ago, it really highlighted the technological innovation of the Wurlitzer organ. Not only was Zorro, Signor Zorro, I should say, featured as the romantic hero fighting the forces of government economic control, but the Wurlitzer organ was a revolutionary one-man orchestra designed to accompany silent films with variable, loud, and dramatic sounds. It had adopted Robert Hope Jones' electrical action and unified pipe system, and it was mass-produced with over 2,000 units throughout theaters in America. In 1921, Dr. Frederick Banting and his assistant Charles Best isolated insulin in the pancreas of dogs at the University of Toronto. This was an incredible breakthrough for reducing high blood sugar and treating diabetes. They were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1923. And in 1926, John Logie Baird, another household name, successfully transmitted the first television picture in his laboratory with a grayscale image, the head of a ventriloquist dummy, nicknamed Stooky Bill. And it was in a 32-line vertically scanned image at 5 pictures per second. Not a lot of clarity, certainly by today's high-definition standards. Baird then went and fetched an office worker named William Trayton to see what a human face would look like. But in 1927, Philo Farnsworth, another household name, made the first TV transmission and created the Farnsworth Television and Radio Broadcast Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And in 1928, Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw developed a respirator known as the iron lung. As professors of public hygiene at Harvard School of Public Health, they created a major breakthrough in the treatment of polio that attacks the patient's ability to control the muscles of the diaphragm. Moving into the 1930s, and despite the Great Depression that was started during the Hoover administration, but was expanded and compounded by President Roosevelt's disastrous expansion of political power, the 1930s has become known as the machine age. Besides continued improvements in radio, television, aviation, consumer appliances, and medicine, there were big developments in materials and chemicals. For example, in 1930, DuPont chemist Arnold Collins discovered neoprene synthetic rubber. This offered greater resistance to oil, heat, and weather and was cheaper than natural rubber. It was produced by the polymerization of chloroprene and used for gaskets and hoses. This is significant. Polymers are the large molecules of long chains with repeating subunits that gave rubber its strength and elasticity. Along those lines, in 1933, B.F. Goodrich researcher Waldo Seaman, another household name, added plasticizers to polyvinyl chloride, known as PVC, a polymer, and turned it into a rubber-like, moldable, and versatile substance used for waterproofing, wire insulation, and corrosion-resistant piping. In 1932, John Cockcroft and Ernest Walton at Cambridge University developed the first particle accelerator and split the atom. Their machine produced 400 kiloelectron volt beam, whatever that is, of protons to split lithium atoms. And this marked a significant milestone in particle physics. Early experimental designs, such as Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron, was developed in 1930. And in 1935, radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, was demonstrated by Scottish physicist Sir Robert Walton-Watt. He successfully proved that radio waves could detect aircraft, leading to the rapid development of an early warning system for the British military in 1939. So far, we have discussed the people, the ideas, the technology, and the impact that it's had on our lives. These were advancements, these were new inventions, these were new scientific discoveries from the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s. But where did the money come from? How was it funded? And I'd like to discuss a few of those in a little more detail. Regarding Firth Brown Steele's of Sheffield, England investment in stainless, there's really not enough information to give you dollars, or should I say British pounds, except to say that the investment was modest. Firth Brown Steele was a little pessimistic about the future of stainless until World War I broke out, and military applications became great. Then Firth Brown introduced high chromium nickel stay-bright steel in the 1920s and heavily promoted that to other industries, including the watch industry. Another individual who pioneered new technology and processes was Henry Ford. And there's really not enough information about his investment in the assembly line of Highland Park, Michigan plant, but the company was formed in 1903 with $28,000 from private investors. Now, what is $28,000 in 1903 translated into today's dollars? Probably millions. But eventually, the price of the Model T to consumers in the 1910s and 20s dropped to $850 per car. And at the same time, Henry Ford was able to raise wages to his assembly line workers to $5 per day, which was more than double the prevailing rate. What does this mean? Lower costs, greater access to a mass market population. And the same thing was true with General Electric. They invested $18 million in the manufacture of their monitor top refrigerator. This went for the mass production of units to drive down the cost. $18 million in the 1920s. That's a huge capital investment of private money that was derived from someone's productive effort that could only have been achieved. In other words, that capital could only have been available with the economic freedom and political liberty of Western civilization, the age of reason, the Enlightenment. When introduced in 1927, these revolutionary refrigerators were priced at about $525, but that price dropped to just over $200 in subsequent years. But now I'd like to talk about something even more interesting. Prior to 1920, the movie industry had just moved to California from the East Coast. Why? For the great weather, the natural scenery, and for economic freedom. The structure was also vertically integrated in what is now known as the studio system. But for creative freedom and control, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith in 1919 formed United Artists and invested their personal fortunes in high-risk productions. Although the specific amounts were not readily available, it included new technology for larger studios and the sound equipment needed for talkies. These men and women did not want to become obsolete. And in 1926, Philo Farnsworth of television fame secured an initial $6,000 from California philanthropists Leslie Gorell and George Evanson. However, that money was quickly exhausted after a generator explosion. This is risk capital. That was venture capital, before venture capital really existed in the form we know of it today. Later, a second group of investors provided another $25,000 to continue the research. And in 1939, after winning legal battles with RCA, $300,000 was raised through stock offerings, meaning private investors, for factory production. Ultimately, Farnsworth secured patent royalty contracts with RCA forced to pay for using his technology. Moving forward, there is not enough information about the B.F. Goodrich investment in plasticized PVC, polyvinyl chloride, after its discovery by Walter Seaman, but by the end of World War II, it could manufacture 10 million pounds per year. Today, Akron, Ohio, has transitioned from the rubber capital of the world to the polymer capital of the world. I had known this because I was the branch manager for the Akron, Ohio branch for a major Wall Street firm about 20 years ago. And lastly, the mighty Wurlitzer organ. It was originally manufactured in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I live now. But that was later moved to North Tonawanda, New York, near where I grew up. And regarding some of the costs related to the installation of the mighty Wurlitzer organ in the 1920s, the Lucas Theater in Savannah, Georgia, installed one in 1925 for $60,000. That was in the dollars of 1925. Maybe multiply that times 10 to translate that into today's dollars. A massive investment of private capital into a risky venture, silent movies. The Egyptian Theater in Oregon installed one in 1925 for $32,000. I'm not sure why it cost so much less. Maybe it was a lesser model. But the Burns Opera House in Colorado installed one in 1927 for even less, for $14,000. Still six figures in today's dollars. But the Fox Theater in Detroit installed one at a cost of more than $100,000 in 1928. A theater investing $1 million in today's money in an orchestra that was basically a machine, of course, with a skilled operator. And lastly, the Orpheum Theater in Memphis, Tennessee, installed an organ in 1928 for a total cost of $19,000. Again, private capital that would not have been available if it had not been for the economic freedom and political liberty of a capitalist system. But all of these names that you have heard in my podcast today, 16 of them you have never heard of recent American history, and 3 more were more famous: Henry Ford, Douglas Fairbanks, and Robert Wurlitzer. All of them had active minds that were energized by the political liberty of Western civilization, the economic freedom of capitalism, and the wealth that is created by free markets. As mentioned, these are the unsung heroes who I believe have earned the status of protected class. If that were be the case today, that would be poetic justice. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you will tune in next week when I discuss the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, the first decade of the 20th century. Thank you, and have a great day.